First up is The War with Grandpa, and this is one of those movies where my number one question when watching it is, who is this film aimed at? So the premise is Robert De Niro, yes, that Robert De Niro, plays a grandfather who is getting older. His wife has passed away, so he moves in with his daughter and her family, and his daughter is played by Uma Thurman. His son-in-law is played by Rob Riggle, and his grandson is played by Oaks Fegley. And basically, Robert De Niro's character is given his grandson's room, and so they enter into this little turf war. And I think that premise-wise, I'm sure there's plenty of comedy there. The kid demands his room back, and he declares that they're at a war, and I feel like this must have been based on like a graphic novel for kids or something like that. It's a slightly older protagonist, but it's actually aimed at a younger audience. So here's where it gets weird, though. There are a lot of jokes in this film aimed at older people. There are jokes aimed at senior citizens. Robert De Niro has this kind of crew of older folks he hangs out with who are played by Cheech Marin and Christopher Walken. And by the way, Christopher Walken is the best part of this movie. I mean, I'd watch Christopher Walken in almost anything, but he is just, it's very funny in this. I think he's the only funny part of this, to me at least. And then there are a lot of jokes that are slightly more mature. There are just so many jokes about Rob Riggle, the son-in-law, seeing Robert De Niro's junk. Like, there are a bunch of physical setups where he just walks in on him in the bathroom and this and that. I'm like, that's not really aimed at younger kids. That's a joke that maybe is for adults, maybe is for teenagers. It also feels, it's not homophobic per se. It just feels very pointless to me because little kids aren't necessarily grossed out by that at that point. I feel like the age demographic that the rest of the humor is aimed at doesn't quite fit with the whole let's shame people about their bodies and let's make people feel uncomfortable about genitals, basically. There should be no sexual humor for an age group that the rest of the physical comedy is aimed at. So why are we bringing this element into it? It's just, I find it very bizarre. And then I think the other question is, are we supposed to like the kid? Are we supposed to like the protagonist? Robert De Niro is doing his best to be a calmer, likable, level-headed grandpa, and I'm assuming that maybe he has grandkids who he signed on to this because he was like, okay, sure, something my grandkids can watch because they can't watch half of the other stuff I'm in. But ultimately, this film just felt like a complete waste of talent. And I hope everyone got a really big paycheck from it or something, because I'm not sure why they signed on. Jane Seymour's in it. She was a fine addition. It's just, I was very confused as to why people signed on to this, aside from what I just mentioned in terms of maybe the older actors have grandkids who they want them to be able to see something that they're in. My biggest takeaways from this film were, it was 90 minutes and I was bored. It got very tedious. It got very repetitive. There's a lot of the physical jokes that just keep going and going, and they aren't funny. That's the thing. I will laugh at a physical joke just as quickly as the next person, but I don't think they're funny. I don't think they'd be funny to little kids who might even have a lower standard for this. There's this whole weird plot line where there's a younger sister or Robert De Niro's other grandkid who is obsessed with Christmas, and I'm just thinking, this film isn't coming out near Christmas. Why are we, maybe it was originally supposed to, but why are we having that whole plot line be a thing? It doesn't really add to anything. There were a couple gags that were reliant on it, but it was messy, it was sloppy. I don't think young kids will enjoy it. I don't think older kids will enjoy it because it's too juvenile for them. And then I don't think adults will enjoy it because it's too juvenile for them. So really, I don't think anyone's going to enjoy this movie. I'm only going to give it 1.6 out of 5. And then there's The Lie, which, not my normal cup of tea. I agreed to watch it because Blumhouse, which is a studio that Jason Blum is behind, they're really sort of cornering the market on horror-type films. The most notable one, I think, of course, is Get Out, that they were involved in. And then they've been producing and directing and etc. Pretty much all horror-related films. And I think they are getting very good at cornering that sort of market. And I think it's a quantity over quality scenario sometimes. But they, for the month of October, put out a bunch of films on Amazon Prime. And this looked the least scary of them. And so I agreed as part of the podcast I'm on to watch this one because I think it was the one I could handle because I don't like horror movies. This was not a horror movie because this was not a good movie at all. I think, if anything, it's sort of a mystery thriller. The other films that Blumhouse is putting out as part of this October thing look more traditional horror, and I see that sort of spooky, creepy, jump-out stuff. This is more psychological. But basically, we follow Joey King playing a character, and her father's played by Peter Sarsgaard. Her mother's played by Muriel Enos. And I don't even know how to describe this film. So basically, Joey King's character gets in a fight with her friend and pushes her off a bridge. And that's all I will say about the plot, because the plot is very thin and there's a couple things that happen, etc., and that's not really the point of it. And I didn't feel a sense of suspense. I didn't feel a sense of urgency with anything. The lie is in that her parents decide, you know what, our kid may or probably killed someone and says she killed someone. We're just going to cover it up. That's the logical solution. And I'm thinking, what sort of psychopath parents think, yes, we should just pretend this didn't happen and expect our teenage daughter to live with this forever, and we will live this forever, and everyone will be fine for it. That's the core of this movie, and therefore I don't think it's going to be relatable, or it's only relatable to monsters and psychopaths. The performances are... Joey King... I think Joey King is a good actress. I think my problem is she's maybe such a good actress that she keeps picking these unlikable roles, and I get so annoyed by her. But I think it's possibly partially her acting talents. Peter Sarsgaard is fine. This film was made in 2018, and I feel like there's a reason that it's sat sort of in purgatory, and I think it just sort of got tacked on to this Blumhouse anthology thing that's happening. I didn't feel like there's a lot of character progression. The plot itself is dubious at best. To me, it felt like maybe a film student film with a really big budget and access to some actors. The setting was all super clinical and cold, and this is something that's starting to bother me a lot. These films that take place in these gorgeous, super curated houses that do not feel lived in at all. They're so decorated within an inch of their life, and I'm like, nobody lives in a museum like that. It doesn't give me any sense of the world they live in, and it just feels like it is one-dimensional, and I think that is probably the best way to describe this film, one-dimensional. So, cannot recommend this, even if you are a fan of thriller, horror, etc. I think it's going to be a big letdown. It is not worth your time, so I'm only going to give this one 1.5 out of 5.